The silent courtroom. It was a chilly morning, and the atmosphere in the courtroom felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. The usual sounds of shuffling feet and quiet murmurs were now replaced with an eerie stillness. The gavel remained untouched on the judge's desk, waiting for the proceedings to begin. The room was filled with tension, anticipation hanging in the air like a dense fog. Everyone present knew that this case would be different, but no one could have foreseen the events that would soon unfold. Sitting in the defendant's chair was Mark Carter, a man who had been wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. At 39 years old, Mark's life had been shattered 4 years ago when he was convicted of a robbery that ended in tragedy. The robbery, which had resulted in a loss of life, was a case of mistaken identity. Mark had always maintained his innocence, yet the justice system had failed him. He had been sentenced to prison, and his life outside of the bars crumbled. His family, his wife, Jasmine, and their young daughter, Ava, had been torn apart by the weight of the wrongful accusation. Jasmine sat next to Mark, her eyes red and puffy from the tears that had flowed so many times over the years. 4 birthdays had passed without Mark by their side. 4 Christmas mornings had come and gone with Ava asking the same heartbreaking question: why isn't Daddy here? It had been a long and painful 4 years, but today something was different. Today, the truth was finally going to be revealed, but no one knew that the key to unlocking the truth would come from an unexpected source. In the back of the courtroom, Ava sat quietly, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. Her wide brown eyes darted nervously around the room. She was only 7 years old, yet the pain of those 4 years was written across her face. But today, she wasn't just the little girl sitting in the back. Today, Ava was going to do something no one could have imagined. As the judge, a stern woman named Judge Elaine Monroe, prepared to proceed, Ava stood up. Her tiny figure seemed to grow taller as she cleared her throat. Silence fell over the courtroom, and all eyes turned to her. "Your Honor." Ava's voice trembled, but there was determination in her eyes. "Can I say something?" Judge Monroe, taken aback by the interruption, looked at the little girl with curiosity. With a gesture of permission, she motioned for Ava to approach. Jasmine whispered for Ava to sit down, but Ava didn't listen. She wasn't about to back down now. With each step, her small shoes echoed on the cold, hard floor. She clutched her bear tightly in her hands, her knuckles white from the grip. As she reached the bench, Ava looked up at Judge Monroe with a gaze so sincere it made the entire room hold its breath. "My daddy didn't do it," Ava said, her voice quivering but resolute. "He's not a bad man. He's my hero." The room fell into an absolute silence. No one knew what to say or do. Judge Monroe, visibly moved, leaned forward in her chair. "Why do you say that, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Ava's little hands gripped the bear even tighter. "Because my daddy tells me to always tell the truth," she said softly. "He told me he didn't do it. I believe him. Don't you?" A lump formed in Mark's throat as he heard his daughter speak. Jasmine's quiet sobs became more audible, and even the courtroom clerk wiped away a tear. But Ava wasn't done. She had more to say, and she wasn't afraid. "We don't have him at home anymore," Ava continued, her voice quivering. "Mommy cries every night. I cry too, but Daddy always says to be strong. He says the truth always wins." She looked directly at the judge, her little face full of hope. "Can you please help us?" The judge, her own eyes moist, sat back in her chair. It wasn't every day that a 7-year-old broke through the walls of the legal system with nothing but the truth and a plea for fairness. But it was Ava's next words that would change everything. "I've prayed every night for 4 years," Ava said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I prayed for someone to listen. Will you listen?" Judge Monroe, fighting back her own tears, nodded slowly. "I'm listening," she said. And with those 2 words, everything changed. A new hope. As the courtroom doors closed behind the last of the spectators and lawyers, a profound silence settled over the room. The air seemed to thicken with unspoken anticipation. Ava's words had done more than just pierce the stillness of the courtroom. They had sparked something deeper within everyone present. For the first time in years, there was hope that the truth would finally rise from the ashes of Mark's unjust conviction. Ava, still standing beside the judge's bench, clutched her stuffed bear tightly. Her small hands were trembling, but her face radiated a quiet confidence that belied her age. Mark's eyes were glued to her, unable to look away as he realized that his daughter had just done something so powerful, so pure, that it might be the very thing to save him. Jasmine, still processing the whirlwind of emotions that had just flooded the courtroom, placed a hand on Mark's arm. She didn't need to say anything. The tear-streaked faces of those around them, including the court clerk who had discreetly wiped her eyes with a tissue, told the story. No one in the room could deny the truth Ava had so innocently and bravely proclaimed. Mark wasn't guilty. He was the victim of a system that had failed him, a system that was now slowly starting to crack under the weight of its own mistakes. As the judge, Elaine Monroe, wiped the tears that had silently slipped down her cheeks, she composed herself, her gaze never leaving Ava. "I will listen, young lady," Judge Monroe finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've made your case, and now I will do what I can to make sure the truth comes out." With a wave of her gavel, she called for an immediate recess. "We will reconvene shortly. I have ordered an expedited review of the evidence in this case. Please, everyone, take a break." The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as people filed out. Lawyers exchanged quick glances, some unsure of how to process the impact of a child's words on the case they have been working on for years. As the lawyers shuffled out of the room, Mark, Jasmine, and Ava were left alone. The air in the room was thick with tension, yet there was a glimmer of something more, a quiet sense of relief that perhaps, just maybe, they would finally find their way out of this labyrinth of lies. Mark pulled his wife and daughter into a tight embrace, overwhelmed with gratitude and disbelief. "I don't know what to say," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Ava, you've just done something incredible. I don't know how I can ever thank you." Ava, still clutching her bear, looked up at her father with a look of quiet determination. "You don't need to thank me, Daddy," she said softly. "I just did what you always told me to do. I told the truth." Jasmine wiped away a fresh tear and kissed her daughter's forehead. "You're a brave little girl, Ava. You've given us all hope." But in the midst of the rising emotions, Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something still wasn't right. Though he was grateful for Ava's courage, and though he was filled with hope that the truth would soon be revealed, he couldn't ignore the years of pain that had come before this moment. The 4 years spent in prison, separated from his family, haunted him still. It was impossible to forget the cold, sterile walls of his cell, the days blending together into an endless blur of hopelessness. He thought back to the many nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the truth would ever come to light. Would he ever walk free again? Would his family ever be whole? But now, Ava's innocent words seemed to hold a key. The truth had not just been silenced by the walls of the courtroom, but also by the oversight of the legal system, a system that had failed to listen to the small voices, to the cries for help from the wrongfully convicted. Jasmine squeezed his hand, sensing his thoughts. "We'll get through this, Mark," she said, her voice steady. "We have to. For Ava. For all of us." And it was in that moment that Mark realized that this battle was not just for his freedom. It was for the countless others like him, whose voices had been drowned out by the system. It was for the men and women who had spent years behind bars for crimes they didn't commit, people whose names were forgotten, their stories untold. Ava had given him a second chance, but now he had a duty to fight for others too. The time for silence was over. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the court officials were in a frenzy. The review of the evidence that had been ordered by Judge Monroe had begun, and the room that had once been filled with the murmurs of the audience was now buzzing with the rapid typing of clerks and attorneys. They worked tirelessly, combing through every scrap of evidence, every document, every file that had been part of Mark's case. They were searching for anything that could substantiate the claim that Mark was innocent. After what seemed like an eternity, the breakthrough came. The key piece of evidence had been overlooked for years: surveillance footage from the night of the robbery. The video wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough to see that the man committing the robbery was not Mark. The perpetrator had a similar build, but the details didn't match. Mark had been miles away, working his shift at a factory that had logged his attendance that night. The footage was enough to prove that Mark was innocent. It was clear as day, but for years, no one had bothered to examine it. It was a clerical oversight, a simple mistake that had led to the unjust imprisonment of an innocent man. The officers and officials involved in the case had simply assumed that Mark was guilty based on circumstantial evidence. But now, the truth was undeniable. The video had surfaced, and Mark had been exonerated. Back in the courtroom, Judge Monroe called everyone back to the stand. When the video was presented, a hush fell over the room. The prosecution, once so certain of Mark's guilt, could no longer argue the case. Mark had been wrongfully convicted, and it was now clear that the true criminal was still out there. Mark, who had remained silent during the review, felt the weight of the moment bear down on him. He had always known the truth, but now the world knew too. He looked to his wife, Jasmine, who was sitting beside him, her eyes filled with tears of relief. He felt Eva's small hand in his, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like a free man. Judge Monroe's gavel struck the desk with a force that echoed through the courtroom. I hereby order the immediate release of Mark Carter. An investigation into the mishandling of this case will be launched immediately. Her voice rang with authority, but there was a softness to it, a compassion for the injustice that had been done. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity, but amidst the chaos, all Mark could hear was his daughter's voice in his head, her simple but powerful words. "I told the truth." And in that moment, he realized that Ava had been the one to break the chains of his imprisonment. It hadn't been the lawyers. It hadn't been the evidence. It had been the pure heart of a child, a heart that believed in what was right, in what was just, and in the power of truth. The journey wasn't over yet, but for the first time in 4 long years, there was hope. The unthinkable. The weight of the moment crashed over Mark, Jasmine, and little Ava like a tidal wave. The truth now unmistakably laid bare. The courtroom that had once felt like a place of cold authority now felt warmer, filled with the buzz of disbelief and relief. The walls of injustice that had once seemed impenetrable now appeared to be crumbling, piece by piece. Mark could hardly believe it. The disbelief in his heart, the years spent in prison, all seemed to evaporate in an instant as the truth finally found its way to the surface. The years had been a blur of uncertainty, anguish, and helplessness. The nightmare that had been his life for the past 4 years had felt like it would never end. But now, standing in front of the courtroom, watching his daughter, Ava, clutching her bear, he could feel a glimmer of light breaking through the darkness that had consumed them for so long. Ava's bravery had done more than simply spark an investigation. It had catalyzed a transformation within Mark. He had been fighting for his own freedom, his own life, but now something inside him shifted. This was no longer just about clearing his name. This was about bringing justice to the countless others who had suffered silently, like him, wrongfully accused, trapped in a system that didn't always seek the truth. As Ava continued to hold his hand tightly, Mark looked around the courtroom. The faces of the legal team, the judge, and even the bailiffs seemed to be frozen in shock and amazement. The prosecutor, once so steadfast in his conviction of Mark's guilt, now looked like a man who had been caught in his own web of lies. The defense attorney, who had fought tirelessly for Mark's release, was busy exchanging knowing glances with colleagues. No one expected this. No one could have predicted that a child's testimony would be the final thread that unraveled the fabric of the injustice Mark had been subjected to. But it was more than just Ava's words. It was the clarity and truth that resonated with everyone present. The video evidence that had been overlooked for so long was now irrefutable. The real criminal had been identified. A man who resembled Mark in build, but had a different face. A man who had committed the crime, not Mark. This was not just a clerical error or a misunderstanding. It was a gross failure of the justice system. The very institution meant to protect the innocent had failed miserably. And now it had to face the consequences. Judge Monroe, her expression hardening, rose from her chair. "I have seen enough," she said with quiet authority. "This case is closed. Mark Carter, you are hereby exonerated of all charges. The court will launch a full investigation into how such an egregious error was made and how it went unnoticed for so long." A sense of finality swept over the courtroom. Mark, his mind still reeling from the overwhelming flood of emotions, remained on his knees, still clutching Ava tightly. He hadn't yet fully comprehended the enormity of what was happening, how his life, his family's life, would be forever altered by this moment. He simply held on to his daughter, his heart swelling with a mix of relief, joy, and a deep sorrow for all the time he had lost. Jasmine, tears streaming down her face, knelt beside them, taking Ava into her arms and holding her tightly. She kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "You've done it, sweet girl. You've saved us." But Ava, who had remained so composed throughout the ordeal, finally let out a soft sob. The pressure that had been building in her tiny frame for 4 years seemed to release all at once. The weight of knowing her father was innocent, the weight of fighting for his release, had been almost too much for a 7-year-old to bear. But now there was no more fighting. There was only this sweet, unspoken relief that her daddy was coming home. The courtroom, which had once been filled with the cold formality of the law, was now filled with a different kind of energy, one of hope, of promise, and of redemption. Mark's eyes, still glistening with unused tears, locked with Judge Monroe's. The woman who had made all this possible, without her willingness to listen to Ava's words, without her compassion for a child's truth, none of this would have happened. The judge's voice softened as she spoke again, addressing the room. "This case will not just be a footnote in the history of the legal system. This is a wake-up call, a reminder that the system must always listen, must always seek the truth, no matter where it comes from." She paused, her eyes scanning the courtroom. "We are all responsible for this failure, but today we will correct it." With those words, Mark finally stood up, his legs shaky, but his heart filled with a sense of gratitude and purpose he hadn't known in years. Ava looked up at him, and without saying a word, he pulled her into another embrace. He could feel her little arms around his neck, and it was as though all the years of separation, all the pain, had melted away in that moment. Jasmine, too, wrapped her arms around them both, her body shaking with emotion. The three of them stood there, huddled together in the middle of the courtroom, as the world around them began to take on a new shape. Their world, once fractured and broken, was now whole again. As the bailiff approached with the formal papers for Mark's release, the sound of hurried footsteps filled the room. A police officer, her face filled with surprise and regret, approached Mark. "I am deeply sorry for the injustice you've suffered, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice genuine. "We will ensure that this never happens again, and we will investigate how it was allowed to happen in the first place." Mark nodded, but he didn't speak. His heart was still full of emotion, and the words seemed to escape him. What could he say? His life, his family's life, was changing forever in that moment, but it was the simple truth that had set him free. His daughter had spoken up, and now they would get the justice they deserved. The following days were a whirlwind. The media descended upon their small town, eager to cover the story of the man wrongfully imprisoned for 4 years. But it wasn't just Mark's story that captivated the world. It was Ava, the little girl who had bravely stood in a courtroom and spoken the truth that everyone wanted to hear about. Ava became a symbol of hope and justice, her innocence and courage capturing the hearts of people across the country. Mark, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, spoke to the press for the first time since his release. He was emotional but steadfast as he shared his story. "I've spent 4 years of my life in a place I never should have been. I was a victim of a system that didn't listen. But today, I am free. Not because of anything I did, but because of my daughter. Ava was my voice when I had no voice. She never stopped believing in me. She never stopped telling the truth." He paused, wiping away a tear. And that's the real story here. The truth always wins, no matter how long it takes. The press conference ended, and as the crowd dispersed, Mark felt a sense of peace begin to settle over him. He had spent so many years in the shadows, fighting for his name to be cleared. But now his fight had just begun. Mark wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for the countless others who had been wrongfully convicted, their stories buried under the weight of the system's mistakes. He had been given a second chance, and he wouldn't let it go to waste. But the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There were many more battles to fight, many more voices to raise. Mark wasn't just a man who had been exonerated. He was now a symbol of justice, a beacon for the voiceless, and he was determined to see it through. As the days passed and life began to return to some sense of normalcy, one thing was clear: Ava's bravery had changed everything. And as Mark and his family moved forward, they carried with them the power of truth and the unshakable belief that one voice, no matter how small, could indeed change the world. The fallout. The news of Mark Carter's exoneration rippled far beyond the small courthouse. It was a story that resonated with people across the country, a beacon of justice amid the shadows of corruption and negligence that sometimes stained the legal system. But as much as the celebration of his release filled the air, the aftermath would prove to be even more explosive than anyone had anticipated. For Mark, Jasmine, and little Ava, their world had been turned upside down. But now that they were free, the hard work of reclaiming their lives was just beginning. The immediate sense of relief was intoxicating, but the weight of what had happened over the past 4 years continued to loom over them like a dark cloud. A media frenzy. The media descended upon their family like a swarm of locusts. News outlets, eager for the story of a wrongfully convicted man walking free, flooded their home with cameras and reporters. Mark and Jasmine, although appreciative of the support, felt overwhelmed. They had spent so long in hiding, isolated from the world, that the sudden attention was both exhilarating and terrifying. Ava, who had become the face of innocence and bravery, was now being hailed as a hero, a symbol of hope for the voiceless. Everywhere they went, people would stop them. Strangers offering congratulations, reporters asking for interviews, and fans of Ava's heartfelt words filling their inboxes with messages of admiration. Mark couldn't help but be proud of his little girl, but he also recognized the burden her newfound fame carried. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was a symbol of something greater than herself. A pressure rested on her tiny shoulders that Mark wasn't sure she could fully understand. But through it all, Ava remained her cheerful self. She didn't understand the media frenzy, nor did she care. To her, her father was simply coming home, and that was all that mattered. The attention, the cameras, the reporters, they didn't faze her. What did, however, was seeing her parents stressed. Ava's role in this whirlwind might have been important, but she was still just a child, one who craved the return to normalcy and stability. Despite the chaos, Mark knew that they had to keep their focus. He had a mission now, one that was much bigger than his own freedom. His heart ached for the many men and women who had sat in prison, unjustly convicted, without anyone to fight for them. Their stories were silenced in a system that was supposed to protect the innocent, but often failed them. Mark's life was a testament to that failure. But now, with the truth finally on his side, he had an obligation to help others find justice. Filing the lawsuit. The first major step in their journey was a lawsuit. Mark had spent 4 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, and he wasn't about to let the state walk away without facing consequences. He filed a $20 million lawsuit against the state, not just for the lost years, but for the emotional toll it had taken on him and his family. He filed for emotional damages, for the trauma of being separated from his wife and daughter, for the countless nights he had laid awake, wondering if he would ever see them again. But Mark's lawsuit wasn't just about him. It was about the people who had been wrongfully convicted without anyone to fight for them. Those who had spent years in prison, with no one willing to believe their innocence. It was for them, too, that Mark stood tall and refused to back down. Jasmine was with him every step of the way. They didn't want the attention or the money. They just wanted accountability, an acknowledgement that their family had been broken by a flawed system. They wanted to ensure that what happened to them would never happen again. The amount of the lawsuit didn't matter as much as the principle behind it. The legal system had failed them, and now they were going to make sure it would never fail anyone else. Mark was careful in how he presented the lawsuit. He didn't want to be seen as vindictive or angry. He simply wanted the world to know that their story wasn't just a singular tragedy. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, and it was a problem that needed to be fixed. The state's reaction was swift. Attorneys scrambled to prepare for the battle that was about to unfold in the courtroom, knowing that this case would not only challenge the specific wrong done to Mark, but also put a spotlight on the larger issue of wrongful convictions. Becoming a voice for the voiceless. As the lawsuit gained traction, Mark found himself with a platform he had never asked for but now felt an obligation to use. He began speaking publicly about wrongful convictions, about the flaws in the system that had almost cost him everything. His story became a rallying cry for justice reform, and people began to take notice. He spoke at rallies, on television, and at public forums, sharing his experience in the hopes of educating others on the risks of a justice system that sometimes prioritizes expediency over truth. But Mark didn't just talk about his own case. He used his newfound voice to shine a light on the countless others who were still suffering, who had been wrongfully imprisoned and forgotten. He met with organizations that fought for criminal justice reform, offering his story as both a warning and a beacon of hope. "I'm lucky," he said in one of his interviews. "I had my daughter. I had my wife. I had a voice that was willing to speak up. But what about the ones who don't? The ones whose families can't afford to fight, the ones who don't have a 7-year-old girl to stand up for them." His voice trembled, but he stood firm. "I was given my freedom back, but what about the others? We can't let their stories go untold. We can't let them suffer in silence." His words resonated deeply with the public, and Mark became a face of reform. He knew the work was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, but he was ready to fight. Ava, his beacon of hope, had shown him the power of a single voice, and now Mark was using his own to push for change. The investigation into the injustice. Behind the scenes, an investigation into how the mistake had been made in Mark's case began to unfold. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about ensuring that the system was held accountable. The mistake that had kept Mark in prison for 4 years had not been an accident. It was a result of incompetence, negligence, and, in some cases, corruption. The footage that had finally exonerated Mark had been overlooked for years. How had this happened? How had a single piece of evidence been ignored for so long? The investigation revealed a shocking truth. There had been multiple failings at every level. From the initial mishandling of the evidence to the rushed trial, there had been a systematic failure to ensure the integrity of the legal process. The prosecution had been overly eager to pin the crime on someone, anyone, without fully investigating the case. The defense had been underfunded and ill-equipped to challenge the mounting circumstantial evidence against Mark. The result was a conviction based on an assumption of guilt, not on the facts. As the investigation progressed, new light was shed on the broader systemic issues in the justice system. Cases like Mark's were not isolated incidents. They were part of a troubling pattern that affected thousands of people, many of whom did not have the resources or the voice to fight back. The fallout from Mark's exoneration reached deep into the corridors of power. Lawyers, judges, and police officers were called to account for their actions. Many were placed on administrative leave, some faced disciplinary action, and a few were even fired. But for Mark, the true victory was not in the punishment of those who had wronged him. It was in the changes that were beginning to take shape within the system itself. A new chapter. As the months passed, Mark's life began to return to a semblance of normalcy, but it was a new normal. The pain of the past would never truly disappear, but with Ava and Jasmine by his side, Mark knew that he could face anything. The fight for justice was far from over, but Mark had come to understand that his family, his unwavering belief in the truth, and his daughter's voice had set the course for something much greater. He had been given his second chance, and now he wasn't just going to live for himself. He was going to live for the countless others who had been silenced, forgotten, and wronged by the system. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a victory for all of them. Mark's journey, alongside his family, was just beginning. The road to justice was long, but with Ava's strength and his unwavering commitment to truth, Mark was ready to fight for a better world. A world where no one would ever have to suffer the way he had. Ava's moment. As the whirlwind of public attention settled into a quiet routine, a new chapter began to unfold in the lives of Mark, Jasmine, and Ava. The battle for justice was far from over, but the family had been granted a rare gift: time together. The months after Mark's exoneration were a period of reflection, healing, and most importantly, a realization of just how much Ava's bravery had truly changed the course of their lives. Ava, now 8 years old, had become more than just a symbol of truth and courage. She was their anchor, the glue that had kept their family from falling apart when everything seemed to be crumbling. Ava's pure heart and innocence had shattered the facade of a legal system that often failed to protect the innocent. But despite the attention and adoration she received, Ava remained a young girl, yearning for normalcy and peace, away from the spotlight that seemed to follow her wherever she went. At home, life had returned to a new kind of normal. There were no more prison visits, no more lonely nights spent wondering when they would see each other again. Mark and Jasmine were no longer separated by the cold metal bars that had kept them apart for 4 long years. But the shadow of those years lingered, creeping into their minds like a ghost they could never quite escape. Ava, however, seemed to have a gift for living in the present. She would play with her toys, her imagination running wild, pretending to be a superhero who could save the world. She still held onto her beloved stuffed bear, which she had carried with her throughout the entire ordeal. To Ava, the past was just that, the past. What mattered now was that her father was home, and she could curl up next to him at night, safe and sound. Yet, as much as Mark and Jasmine wanted to shield Ava from the chaos of the outside world, it became impossible to keep her entirely out of the public eye. The media had not forgotten about the little girl who had stood up in court and spoken the truth. Journalists were constantly asking for interviews, and public appearances were becoming an increasingly common part of their lives. Ava's image was plastered across social media and news outlets, her simple plea for justice and truth resonating deeply with people everywhere. Ava had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that sometimes the smallest voices could echo the loudest. But Mark and Jasmine worried about the weight of the pressure on her young shoulders. They had to remind her often that she didn't have to carry the burden of the world on her own. No one was expecting her to be perfect or to continue playing the role of a savior. Still, Ava took it all in stride. She never let the attention change her. In fact, she didn't fully understand the significance of her actions. She knew her daddy was free, and that was all that mattered. When people asked her for her thoughts or to share her feelings, she would simply say, "I just told the truth." It was so simple, so pure, that people who met her were struck by the innocence and clarity of her words. But behind the scenes, Ava's parents saw the subtle shifts in their daughter's behavior. She was still the same playful child, but there was a depth to her now. She had become wise beyond her years, having faced a reality most adults would never know. One evening, after a particularly long day of interviews and meetings, Mark and Jasmine sat in the living room, watching Ava play in the backyard. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the yard. Ava was running around, her laughter filling the air as she chased after a butterfly, completely oblivious to the fact that she had become an icon. Mark sat back in his chair, his thoughts heavy. Jasmine, noticing the look in his eyes, joined him, sitting down beside him with a sigh. "Do you think we've done the right thing?" Mark asked softly, his voice filled with concern. "I mean, she's only 8. She doesn't fully understand the weight of all of this." Jasmine gazed at their daughter, her eyes softening. "She understands more than we give her credit for," she said gently. "She's the reason we're here. She's the reason you're free." Mark nodded slowly, still unsure. "But the world is watching her. She's already become more than just our daughter. She's this symbol. And I'm afraid she'll grow up feeling like she has to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders." Jasmine placed a reassuring hand on his. "She's still just a little girl, Mark. And as long as we're here, we'll make sure she knows she doesn't have to be anything more than that. She doesn't have to carry anything but her own happiness." The sound of Ava's laughter drifted through the window, and both parents turned to watch their daughter, who was now lying on the grass, staring up at the sky, lost in her own thoughts. It was clear that Ava had already begun processing the world around her, perhaps in ways that no one could fully comprehend. But in that moment, she was simply a child. A child who had done something extraordinary, without even fully realizing it. Ava's quiet strength. Over the following weeks, as the media frenzy began to die down, Ava started to retreat from the public eye. Mark and Jasmine made a conscious effort to shield her from too many interviews, redirecting the focus back to the systemic issues of wrongful convictions and the need for justice reform. They both knew that Ava's role in their story was essential, but it was also fleeting. They wanted her to have a childhood that wasn't marred by the weight of her newfound fame. Ava, for her part, was more than willing to step back. She had already said everything she needed to say. There was nothing more for her to do except be herself. She continued to play in the yard, to read her favorite books, and to color with crayons, just as she had done before any of this had started. But even in her quiet moments, there was an undeniable strength to her. It was in the way she would comfort her parents when they seemed troubled, or how she would look up at the stars and talk about her hopes for the future. One afternoon, while Mark was flipping through a stack of legal papers, he heard Ava's voice calling from the backyard. She was sitting on a swing, her legs dangling, and her eyes were focused on the horizon. "Daddy," she said, her voice carrying a note of curiosity. "Do you think the world will be okay now?" Mark set the papers aside and walked out to her, kneeling beside the swing. He could see the seriousness in her eyes, the weight of the question, even though her face remained calm. It wasn't the kind of question he had expected from a child her age. "I think the world will be okay," he said gently, "because there are more people like you out there. People who will always speak the truth, no matter what. People who will make sure others are heard." Ava nodded thoughtfully. "I want to be like that," she said, her voice soft but sure. Mark smiled at her, his heart swelling with pride. "You already are, sweet girl. You already are." A shift in perspective. As Mark and Jasmine continued to use their platform to advocate for those wrongfully convicted, they began to see real, tangible changes in the system. The investigation into how Mark had been unjustly imprisoned led to a series of reforms, with new measures being implemented to ensure that evidence was reviewed more thoroughly in future cases. The state was now committed to identifying and correcting wrongful convictions, with Mark's case serving as a stark reminder of the damage that could be done when the system failed. But the real victory was not just in the reforms, it was in the way Ava's courage had sparked a broader movement. The public's awareness of wrongful convictions had grown exponentially, and organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform had begun to attract more support and funding. Ava had become a symbol of truth, a shining example of what it meant to fight for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In time, Mark and Jasmine realized that while their lives had been irrevocably changed by the events of the past few years, they had also gained a new perspective. They had learned to appreciate the small moments, the quiet joys of family life, and the power of truth. Ava's simple but powerful words had shown them that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from the courage to speak up when it matters most. As the years went by, Ava continued to grow, her voice becoming stronger with each passing day. But no matter where life took her, no matter how much she achieved or how far she went, one thing would remain the same. She would always remember that it was the truth that set her father free, and the truth that could change the world. The power of one voice. As the years passed and time began to heal the wounds that had once felt insurmountable, Mark, Jasmine, and Ava found themselves in a new chapter of life. Their journey through the storm of wrongful imprisonment, public scrutiny, and the aftermath of a flawed justice system had taught them invaluable lessons. The trials they had endured had hardened their resolve, but they also softened their hearts in ways they never anticipated. Now they were not just survivors. They were change-makers, advocates, and a family determined to ensure that no one would ever have to face what they did without someone by their side. The world had not forgotten Ava. Far from it. People still called her the little girl who spoke the truth, and with good reason. Her words, simple yet powerful, had struck at the core of what justice meant, shifting the focus away from the complexity of legal procedures and toward the purity of truth itself. She had stood up when the odds were stacked against her, speaking for her father when no one else would. In doing so, she had become a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for those who had been wrongfully imprisoned, their stories buried under the weight of systemic failures. Ava, now a teenager, had grown into someone who fully understood the weight of her actions. She had always known that speaking the truth was the right thing to do, but now she was able to see the ripple effects of that truth. She saw the ways her story had sparked a movement, igniting conversations about criminal justice reform, the flaws in the system, and the need for a more compassionate approach to those who had been wronged by the courts. What had begun as a desperate plea from a child had grown into a full-fledged advocacy campaign that touched the lives of countless people. But as Ava matured, she faced the challenges of growing up under the intense scrutiny that often comes with being in the public eye. Her teenage years were not marked by the usual carefree moments that many her age experienced. Instead, Ava was asked to speak at rallies, participate in interviews, and meet with lawmakers to help push forward the reform that her story had helped to inspire. Despite the attention, Ava remained grounded. Her family, particularly Mark and Jasmine, made sure to keep her connected to the simple joys of childhood. She spent her summers playing in the garden, riding her bike through the neighborhood, and hanging out with her friends. She was still the same Ava, the little girl who had once held her stuffed bear and spoken up for the truth, only now she was a young woman with an unwavering sense of justice. Mark and Jasmine, too, had been irrevocably changed by their experiences. The pain of the past 4 years would never fully disappear, but it had been transformed into a source of strength, a foundation upon which they could build something bigger than themselves. They had once been trapped in a broken system that had torn their family apart, but now they were actively working to fix that system, to ensure that no other family would have to endure the same suffering. Together, they launched a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping those who had been wrongfully convicted. Their mission was to advocate for the innocent, support families who had been affected by miscarriages of justice, and work with lawmakers to create lasting reform in the criminal justice system. The nonprofit quickly gained traction, attracting supporters from all corners of the country. It became a beacon of hope for those who had lost their voice, their freedom, or their dignity in a flawed system that was quick to judge, but slow to correct its mistakes. The road to reform. In the years following their victory, Mark, Jasmine, and Ava traveled across the nation, speaking to communities and lawmakers about the importance of justice reform. They met with victims of wrongful convictions, some of whom had spent decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit. These were stories that had never been told, voices that had been silenced, and the family knew that their work had only just begun. Mark had become a tireless advocate for reform. His speeches, interviews, and public appearances were focused on a single mission: to expose the flaws in the system and to push for the adoption of new policies that would prevent innocent people from being incarcerated. He met with legislators, participated in high-level meetings with government officials, and worked alongside criminal justice organizations to draft new bills aimed at improving the system. The influence of his case was far-reaching, and it was clear that he had become a key player in the fight for reform. One of the key initiatives that Mark worked on was the establishment of a national database for wrongful convictions, a system that would track individuals who had been exonerated and provide resources to help them rebuild their lives. For those who had been wrongly imprisoned, the physical and emotional scars often lingered long after their release. Mark knew firsthand how difficult it was to re-enter society after being unjustly convicted. The impact on mental health, employment, and family life was profound, and he wanted to make sure that those who had been wronged received the support they needed to recover. Mark's work wasn't without its critics. Many people who were invested in the status quo of the justice system saw his push for reform as a threat. They argued that the system was already working fine and that wrongful convictions were rare occurrences. But Mark refused to be silenced. He knew what had happened to him, and he knew that for every person like him who was fortunate enough to find the truth, there were countless others who didn't have the same opportunity. His work was not about vengeance or anger. It was about making sure that no one else was subjected to the same injustice. Ava's growing role. As Ava reached adulthood, her role in the reform movement began to expand. She had become an articulate and passionate advocate for justice, speaking at conferences and participating in panel discussions about criminal justice reform. Her voice was now heard on a global stage as she addressed lawmakers and leaders from around the world. But despite the growing pressure and the increased expectations placed upon her, Ava never lost sight of the core values that had driven her from the start: truth, compassion, and justice. Ava's unique position, both as a victim of the system and as a voice for reform, allowed her to connect with people in a way few others could. She was able to speak from personal experience, sharing her story and the impact it had on her family. But more importantly, she was able to listen. She listened to the stories of those who had been wronged by the system, offering them her support and using her platform to give them a voice. Ava had become more than just a symbol. She had become a leader in the movement for justice reform. Mark watched with pride as his daughter spoke to groups of lawmakers, sharing her vision for a future where the justice system no longer failed the innocent. She had inherited his determination and his unshakable belief in the power of truth. But she also brought something unique to the table: a deep empathy for those who had suffered and a desire to make the world a better place for everyone. Ava's work was transformative. She spearheaded several initiatives aimed at raising public awareness about wrongful convictions and criminal justice reform. One of her most notable projects was a documentary that chronicled the stories of several wrongfully convicted individuals, including Mark's own. The documentary, which received widespread critical acclaim, was a game-changer in the fight for justice. It brought the stories of the forgotten to the forefront, showing the human cost of a flawed system and the urgent need for change. The ripple effect. As the movement for justice reform continued to grow, the ripple effect of Mark and Ava's efforts began to be felt across the country. Several states introduced new legislation aimed at preventing wrongful convictions, including reforms to the way evidence was reviewed and how defense attorneys were funded. These changes, while small in the grand scheme of things, were significant steps toward a more just and equitable system. But even as progress was being made, Mark knew that there was still much work to be done. The fight for justice was a long one, and it required the dedication and persistence of those who refused to give up. For Mark, this fight was no longer just about his own freedom. It was about making sure that the truth was never ignored again, and that the innocent were never forgotten. In the end, it wasn't just the evidence or the legal battles that made a difference. It was the courage of a little girl who refused to be silent. Ava's voice had changed everything. And now her story was being passed on to future generations, an enduring reminder that even in the darkest of times, one voice could ignite a movement that changed the world. And for Mark, Jasmine, and Ava, the journey was far from over. The fight for justice continued, and they were ready to see it through, together.